So this PowerPoint is going to be your notes on page 46, so the graphing using slope-intercept form. The top of it should look like the screen that I have in front of me. So as we talked about each lesson, we're learning an easier way to graph a line. So today's lesson is going to be about slope-intercept form. So if you got to the end of the web class, this was kind of mentioned at the end of it. You also might have heard it in a previous class, but it is most likely the easiest way for you to graph a line. So just to start with some vocab, an equation whose graph is a line is a linear equation. So anything that makes a straight line across will be modeled by a linear equation. We'll talk about what that means later on. So every linear equation has a rate of change, or also known as what we've talked about as slope. So you'll hear rate of change if you have applications, but we usually refer to it as the slope. And it's constant because it doesn't change throughout the line. So that's why it makes a line, because it goes up by the same amount each time. So we talked about that when we found slope from a graph, that you could check it to make sure that more than one point had the same slope, because it shouldn't change from point to point. And then the other part of slope-intercept form is going to be where the graph crosses the y-axis, and that's going to be at the y-intercept. So we've talked about y-intercepts. That's where it goes through the y-axis, so that'll be an important part of your slope-intercept form. So the general slope-intercept form is going to be y equals mx plus b. You'll hear that a lot. So it's something that you want to kind of get in your head. Y equals mx plus b is going to be the general form of a line. And m and b are going to be the numbers that you actually are going to plug in. So the m is going to be the slope. So slope is what we've been calculating from a graph and from points. And b is going to be the y-intercept. So again, the y-intercept is where that line crosses the y-axis. So when you have those two pieces of information, you can actually graph a line pretty easily. And we'll look at that in a little bit. So the next part of the notes is we're going to just talk about identifying the slope and the y-intercept from an equation. So that's what the quizzes game at the end is going to be on. So if we take a look at these examples, these are going to be right under. The first example is y equals 2x minus 3. So we're going to find out what the slope and y-intercept are. In other words, we're looking for the m and the b. So if you go back to the equation we listed above, slope-intercept is y equals mx plus b. So where the m is in the equation is going to be what you're going to put on the m line. And what the b is in the equation, you're going to fill in on the b line. So if I look where the m is in the equation, that's going to be the number 2. So my m is going to be 2. And the b is going to be where the b was in the equation. And if we think about it, it was plus b. So if you have minus 3, you're going to fill in your b as negative 3. So that's an example of just taking the equation and identifying the slope and the y-intercept. So the next example we have is y equals negative 3x minus 5. So if we follow the same format, we have the y equals, this is our m. So our m we're going to fill in as negative 3. And our b is going to be minus 5. So we know that as a negative 5. So again, once you've done a few of these, you'll kind of see that the pattern is that the first number mentioned here with the x is your m, and the one that's being added or subtracted is going to be your b. If we look at the next example, this is going to be the one to the right of the one we just did. It says y equals negative 2/3 x. So this one is a little bit different. There's not a plus or minus here. So we'll talk about what that means in a second. But if we're following what we've done before, the m is the one directly before the x. So the number directly before x, even though it is a fraction, it's still a number. So our m is going to be negative 2/3. And then because we have no plus or minus here, we're assuming that we're adding or subtracting 0. So our b is actually going to be 0. So we'll talk about this later on. That actually means that it goes through the origin. But it's important just to identify if there's no plus or minus that it's going to be 0. All right, and we have 2 more examples we're going to talk about. So the next one is y equals x minus 1. So we know m is the one directly before the x. However, in this equation, there's nothing directly before the x. So we know how to handle this, though, because if there's nothing in front of the x, we know that that means the coefficient is 1. So even though it's not here, I know a 1 is here. which means my m is going to be a slope of 1. And with our b, since we have -1, it's going to be a -1. And then the last example we're going to do, another kind of trick one, but you'll see what it looks like in a second. So we have y equals 3. So the m, again, is the number directly in front of the x. But you might notice in y equals 3 that the number directly in front of the x doesn't exist because there's no x. So if there's no x, that means you can't multiply anything by it. So our slope actually becomes 0. But we do have a number that's not in front of an x. We have a constant. So that's actually going to be a b of 3. This one's a little bit more tricky just because if you remember from the web quest and from what we talked about lines, y equals 3 means every y value is 3. So it's actually a slope of 0, which means this makes sense for why our m is 0. But again, we'll do more with zeros and undefined slopes later on. But the important part is notice that there's no x, so there's no m really to put in front of it. So those are the examples for your classwork today. So take them down, and then you're going to try the quizzes game that's posted on Google Classroom based on what we just learned. So try your best on it, and then we'll continue tomorrow with the rest of these notes.